keeping this thing rolling. I think it got started in 2007, and that's almost 10 years. So it's been nice to see it continue, and Carlos' efforts have been the reason why it's continued. So thank you for that. And yeah, today, so I'm Brett. I've met many of you. I think I know half of you probably by name. And I'm happy to be here today. I just finished a PhD through York University in Toronto. And my research focused on pathways for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Saskatchewan's electricity sector. So how to green the Saskatchewan grid. Come on in. Come on in, and you might want to order it. I don't know. So the research took place over the past year and a half. I've interviewed some of the folks in the room and had a lot of cooperation from people around the province, lots of good cooperation and information from SaskPower and others who are experts in this area. And with this information, I developed an economic analysis of what are the different pathways we could take to lower emissions in the electricity sector. And so, as you're all aware of, if you're sitting here, you all know we're in this climate crisis now. It's 2016. We've got 195 countries who've agreed that we need to keep CO2 emissions to the point where temperature doesn't increase more than 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels, or even 1.5 degrees. To do that, we have to get down to zero emissions pretty much across the board by the end of the century, and to pretty low emissions by mid-century. And Canada's one of many countries who has to do that. Right now, we've got 720 megatons of emissions per year. That's about a 40th of what can be emitted in 2030 if we want to keep on that 2-degree track, and we're one of 196 countries. So we've got to get down quickly. Saskatchewan is 10% of the Canadian total for 1.2 billion people. So our emissions are greater than our proportional population. We need to make a bigger effort to get our emissions down. And we look at electricity. The electricity sector in Saskatchewan is about 21% of our total emissions. So that's an area where we can make a lot of change. And it's an area where there's opportunity because there are substitutes for the way we currently generate electricity. We currently have a mix of coal, about 40–45%, natural gas, hydro, close to 20%, and a few percentage of wind. All of those different technologies create the same electrons that run to your lights and your appliances. So they create a product that's perfectly substitutable, which makes it easy then to change what you're using to generate the electricity. And so we've been on this course where we've focused on coal for a good 50 years. Boundary Dam was commissioned in 1958. It's now, well, it's over 50 years old. And coal has been important to the province. We've used it. It was the industrial strategy to have cheap electricity in the province, and it kept rates low because we had all this cheap coal in the southeast. But now we're having to look at other pathways, and the things that we have to be aware of, the things that are going to affect electricity going into the future, there's a few. First is that we've got federal coal regulations now that say we have to either retire our coal plants or retrofit them with carbon capture and storage. All of that has to happen. I think, well, most of it happens by 2030. The Shand plant gets to stay around until 2042. But by 2042, according to these federal regulations introduced by the Conservatives, all coal plants have to be retired or changed into carbon capture and storage. So that's why we've started down that path with Boundary Dam. But there's
they just use scrubbers?
The regulations say you have to be at 420 grams per megawatt hour. 420 grams CO2 per megawatt hour. So that has to, right now they're about 1,100 grams per megawatt hour. So they have to get down to meet that standard. The only way they can do it is with some carbon capture.
You can't do it with scrubbers?
Scrubbers will take the sulfur dioxide out, and yeah, to clean up the more particulate matter. But that's not the only option we have. So that's one option. We can retrofit the coal plants. We can build new coal plants that are carbon capture and storage. But there's other options, and renewables are one of those options. So when I say renewable energy, I mean wind power, I mean solar power, the kind that Ken Kellen, who's sitting here today, installs with his company Kellen Solar. I mean hydroelectricity. We have existing hydro in the province. We have potential to build more, not a lot more. We've got about 860 megawatts of the big hydro. If we built out every hydro project, every large hydro project in the province, we could have about 3 times that. But that starts to get into projects like building dams on the Churchill River and building in a lot of places up north. So there's hydro potential, but it's limited. And there's also biomass potential, which is limited. You get biomass along the forest fringe. Usually, if you've got waste fuel, leftover wood from a pulp mill, or any other forestry operation, you can use that as a biomass fuel source. So there are these options. And I wanted to do some research into looking at what would it cost to go that pathway versus the coal carbon capture and storage pathway, or the natural gas pathway, or a nuclear pathway, or any other pathway you can think of. So I built some economic models to look into this. And when I started looking at this question, the options for the future, I found that the renewables actually are quite cost competitive. So wind right now is about 6 cents a kilowatt hour for the big projects in Saskatchewan. Compare that to the Boundary Dam retrofit, which costs 17 cents per kilowatt hour if you don't count the CO2 they're supposed to sell to Cenovus, or 14 cents a kilowatt hour if you count that. So it's more than half less in cost than the Boundary Dam project. Solar's coming down, and probably in your lifetime, Ken, maybe you'll have more to say about this after. You can probably talk about how drastically it's come down. And it's likely to continue coming down to the point where, as rates in the province increase and the price of solar goes down, probably by 2030, 2035, it will be cheaper to generate your own power with solar panels on your house than to buy from Sask Power. So that becomes an interesting issue for Sask Power and their business model. They have to think about, how do we keep people on our system if they can have their own power supply. So they got to do some thinking around that. So I looked at these pathways, and my interest was looking at, well, how do we contribute to these global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How do we get emissions to, well, first I looked at, how do we get emissions to 80% below current levels by 2050? So I compared scenarios there. Going with a mix of renewables, largely focused on renewables, you can get to the same place as coal, carbon capture, storage, or nuclear for a little bit extra cost. And the extra cost comes in because when you're building the renewables, you do have to worry about variability. So wind output is kind of like this through the course of a day or a year. Solar output is pretty predictable, or it's, the sun comes out noon, it's peaking, and then it's going down when the sun goes down. But it can be cloudy on different days, and they have less output. In winter, the output is more like this, and so in summer it's a lot more. So there's variability seasonally with solar. Hydro also has seasonal variability. There's a lot more water running in the spring and summer than in the winter. If you have some dams, you can store some of that runoff and keep it for the winter and the spring and use it as a backup then. But you do have to worry about variability. So you have to overbuild the system, and you also have to think about storage, electricity storage. The good news is that we know how to do electricity storage, and the variability of renewables isn't really a technological barrier to integrating renewables onto the grid. But the technology exists to do it. We have a project just east of Regina, the Cowassis Wind and Storage Project. If you drive anytime you're driving out of the city on the number 1 or the number 33, between those two highways, there's one lone turbine. It's on land owned by the Cowassis First Nation. They partnered with the Saskatchewan Research Council. They have an 800 kilowatt wind turbine with 400 kilowatts of batteries, and they've been using that to test how well you can integrate wind onto the system. So they've run tests where at 250 kilowatts, they can provide firm capacity. So they can provide fairly steady electricity at that 250 kilowatts. So it's not the full amount of the system, but it gives you firm capacity, and that's what you hope for if you're a power planner. So we can do variability. We can solve that problem. it's just a matter of how much does it cost to deal with the variability. So that was what I was looking at. You can have this renewable pathway. In that renewable pathway, you also have to think about what's the cost of building the storage, whether it's batteries or pumped hydro storage. If you build a dam, a reservoir on the surface, and you let the water run down underground when you need power, and then pump it back when you've got extra wind, that's a way to store energy. You can have compressed air in natural gas caverns or whole solution mine, potash mines. That's a way to store energy. So there's ways to do this, but they cost money. So I looked at these pathways. To get to 80% reduction, the renewables will cost a little bit extra. But then if you start to add a carbon price into the picture, and you push renewables a bit further, so I was looking at 90% renewables, and that gets you to pretty much 90% reduction from where we're at now for emissions. That scenario starts to be comparable to the others when you put a carbon price in place. But I then decided, well, this is fine to look at 2050 and looking at greenhouse gas emissions in 2050, but can we act quicker? Can we get where we need to go sooner? And how much would that cost? So there's a big opportunity right now. Because of these coal-fired regulations, the coal plants have to be retired or switched over. A lot of other assets are at the end of their life. So there's a need to replenish the generation capacity that exists. That means there's an opportunity to switch that capacity to something else if we want to. We also had electricity demand increasing. That's likely to continue. It's fairly correlated to economic growth in Saskatchewan because it's potash mining that's fairly energy intensive that generates the demand. Some of the other big industries like the northern mining you were talking about. So as we have more economic activity in the province, more people, probably have higher demand, that means we again have to build more generation capacity, and we can decide what that capacity will be. So there's this opportunity to retrofit, replace the existing capacity, and expand, and we can pick our pathway now. This is really a prime opportunity to do that. And if we want to really go full course into renewables, and we're willing to partner with Manitoba to do it, and import some hydro from them. They have projects that are waiting there that they're not building because the demand's not high enough. But they do have hydro projects where they could build them in Manitoba. There's a possibility to link to Saskatchewan. If we did a combination of linking to Saskatchewan, Manitoba hydro projects, and building out the renewables we can build domestically, we can have a greening the grid scenario where we get to near zero emissions by 2040. This again costs a bit more. If you look at prices relative to the other scenarios, it's about 2 cents a kilowatt hour more to go that route. But again, if you start to put carbon pricing in place, that they become equivalent pretty quickly. So in 2050, if we were to do this greening the grid route, get to near zero emissions by 2040, in 2050 we'd have this 2 cents a kilowatt hour difference. But if the carbon tax had been in place from 2015, escalated to that time, the cost would be equivalent to a scenario where we didn't act quickly. So it'd be equivalent to a natural gas scenario or a carbon capture and storage scenario. So we can get there. The technology's there. Technology is getting cheaper. The opportunity is there because we have infrastructure that's turning over. The cost might be higher from just a financial investment standpoint, but if you put a carbon price in place to actually account for the greenhouse gas emissions, it becomes equivalent pretty quickly. So I think that's the finding in my research. I'm going to be putting together a public summary of that information. You're the first people outside of the research participants who've got to hear about it. But that's what I found, and I hope to have this conversation with more people around Saskatchewan and let them know what's possible.
Brett, one pathway you didn't mention was deep geothermal.
Yeah, I looked at that. You know, so if you have data for me on that, I'd be happy to have that. From what I found on geothermal, it's good for space heating, but I haven't found a good study to tell me the cost of doing it in Saskatchewan to create electricity. So you can do it cost effectively to heat a building, but I know that there's someone in the province with a company called Deep who's doing this, I believe.
They had a grant to study it. I would give them some money. I don't know what they're looking for.
When was that?
Just recently.
Recently? Yeah, I think there's this project that they're talking about in Estevan. So I think that's possible. And I'd like to see them, maybe if they build a pilot project, it'd be interesting. They can build it and we'll see the results. I mean, that's always the thing you need to see. With all these technologies, you know, people talk a lot about small modular nuclear reactors. There haven't been any small modular nuclear reactors built in a developed country. There's China and Russia are trying to build them. So we don't really know how much they cost. We know often when nuclear projects are built, they have cost overruns. So we really need to see projects get built to see how much they're going to cost. And when you look at the projects that have been built in Saskatchewan, the wind projects have been fairly affordable and cost effective. I should ask you guys about the cost for the solar projects. But I imagine, as I said, those are getting cheaper all the time.
Actually, I think you're at good parity already.
Good parity already?
This actually leads into a question that I have. Obviously, we have entrepreneurs here. And my question actually to you is going to be, again, not knowing if this is even allowed in the scope of questioning, but where do you see the impact from an entrepreneurial standpoint versus a government action standpoint? Because ultimately, our economy, whether or not we want to agree with it, is all driven by entrepreneurship. So if we can recreate, I deal with finance, and a lot of my oil field guys obviously are crying and not too sure what the hell to do. If they have an opportunity to go to work, they don't give a shit where it is.
Yeah.
So does industry have the capacity to fill that gap, and does entrepreneurship have a role in what you're looking to do?
That's another big question. So the first thing I want to touch on is just the idea of the jobs. So I should say too, when I looked at all these scenarios, I looked at the net jobs created. So the big fear is if we go away from coal, we'll lose jobs, we'll lose coal mining jobs, we'll lose jobs in the coal plants. But any of these other pathways, well, the renewable pathway I've looked at, even when you're importing electricity from Manitoba Hydro, so those jobs are in Manitoba, if you're building wind and you're building solar, I think in my scenario I have about 4,000 megawatts of wind, 1,200 megawatts of solar. If you're building those sorts of numbers for these projects, you're going to have more jobs than the other scenarios. So the jobs are going to be there. I think the question is, can we get people retrained and into the right
Or can we get
college
them to buy
programs?
into the idea that they still have a job if they're willing to go to work, right?
Yeah, and I think the way to do that would be to talk to, so Centennial Wind Farm, 150 megawatts, SaskPower built it and runs it, and they've got, I think they have 17 employees or something, so full-time workers who have good jobs, unionized jobs, and they have jobs. So looking at examples like that and showing that to industry is one way to get some buy-in. But on the entrepreneurial front, I think that's an interesting question. So now it's been interesting the past 2 months. So I did all this analysis over the course of like a year and a half, handed in the final report. A week later, the Premier drops this new announcement that we're going to have 50% renewables by 2030, which is fantastic, and which aligns with some of the scenarios I had. And their analysis saying it's not going to really increase rates. It's the same as what I found when I looked at that. So I think that's great. We've got government starting to head that direction. Now the question is, who's going to build these projects? So the way that wind has worked in the past is you have the SaskPower issues a request for proposals. Private developers come and they bid. So the last time they did this, I think they wanted 200 megawatts of wind, and they got something like 4,000 megawatts of proposals. So we don't